Hello everybody and welcome to this Learn to Play video for Pax Illuminaten, a game in the Pax series from Ion Game Design. I am the game's designer, Oliver Kiley, and looking forward to showing you how to play this game. So first, a note on the historical background and context for the game. It's set in the late 1700s in Bavaria, which was a province of the Holy Roman Empire. And at that time, the church and the nobility did not want people spreading the ideas and the ideals of the Enlightenment around because it was a threat to their authority. And so a University of Ingolstadt professor, Adam Weishaupt, started the Illuminati essentially as a way to begin talking about the Enlightenment and trying to influence those in positions of power to change the social dynamics of the day. And so you are taking on the role of one of the founders of the Illuminati, helping to recruit new membership into the organization with the ultimate goal of changing the social structure. So an overview of the gameplay. It's always good to start with the object of the game. So how the game is set up is there's a basic map of cards that's going to start the game face down, and we'll explain what these cards are about in a moment. But the object of the game is to be the first player to achieve the conditions outlined on two of three available plot cards. And these plot cards all specify a particular arrangement of cards and your influence over these cards that'll be on the map. Two of these plot cards will be public, and then each player will also have their own private plot card that they keep hidden. So you're trying to be able to create this map. So as an example, here is a plot card called Line of Exchange, which says control a lodge of any faction containing at least three cards in the center row. And we'll go on to explain what a lot of these terms mean. But essentially, you'll see that each of these four different cards that are in this group all share a purple nobility faction. We'll explain the factions in a moment. And so if I had more influence across these cards than my opponent, so say I was green and I had 4 influence discs versus 3, I would control that lodge. That lodge has at least 3 cards in the center row, and so I would be able to claim that plot card. So that's the basic idea. You're arranging cards in this map, you're competing with your rivals, and you're trying to get your cards and influence to match the plot cards that you've been assigned. So a little bit about the luminary cards themselves. These really make up the core part of the game and are used in a few different ways, but there's some important terminology to cover here as well. So first, you'll see in the top is the rank. So luminary cards can be a rank 1, 2, or 3, an ace or a crown. All of the rank 1, 2, and 3 cards will have 2 different factions. We'll explain the different factions in a moment. So many of these cards are essentially dual suited. Cards all have a strength numeral on them, which will be used in some of the conflicts. Cards may also have an affiliation, either Freemason as shown here or Rosicrucian. Some cards don't have any additional affiliation. The bottom part of the card is a scheme ability, so it's kind of a special action or ability that you can take with the card. We'll explain how to use those in a moment. And then, of course, there's the title. The game's resources are favor, so cards all have a favor value listed below the title of resources that they can provide. And then, importantly, there are these circular locations where influence discs go, and the favor icons inside that are the costs that you have to pay in order to influence there. And last, just some historical notes at the bottom. So that's the basic anatomy of the luminary cards. Couple of other key important terms is the idea of adjacency in lodges. So cards in the map are adjacent to each other if they share an edge. So this card, for example, is going to be adjacent to all of these other cards, whether they're face up or face down. And then, as we saw just a bit ago when we were talking about the plot cards, there's this idea of lodges. So a lodge is a group of cards that are adjacent to each other that all share at least one faction in common. So in this case, the green Little diamond symbol is the profession faction, and so all three of these cards form a lodge since they all share at least one common faction. So the factions themselves, there's the nobility, there's scholars, there's clergy, artists, magistrates, and the professions. And just a note, over the course of the game, you'll be gaining and spending favor as one of the game's resources. When you are paying for costs at any time, you can convert 3 of one type of favor into another type as part of paying costs. So that's just a general note to know before we get further into things. Okay, we're not going to do an extensive setup discussion as part of this, but we will show the kind of basic bones of how the game is set up. So the core part of the game is the map that you can see on the screen here. And this size of this map will scale depending on the number of players. So in a 2 or a 3-player game, it's this size. In a 4-player game, it gets a little bit larger. So first we'll set up the map. The next is that we set up a court. So we're going to shuffle all of our luminary cards. The ones that go into the map, go into the map. There'll be a draw deck of luminary cards, and then we'll put 5 cards out face up with the Chamberlain token in the leftmost one. And this court is really, if you're familiar with other PAX games, kind of forms a market. Each player will have a hand of 4 cards. All of the favor tokens in the game will be put into a pool. In a 6-player game, there's 6 of each of these favor in the favor pool. Each player has a starting Areopagus card, which also serves as a player aid. They're going to put a contact card that's randomly dealt out to each underneath that shows the starting favor that they'll start with, and they'll take all of their influence discs as well. Each faction has a faction card associated with it, and in a 2-player game, you'll randomly take 3 of those, and those will be available over the course of the game. An event deck will be set up. And then lastly, we'll distribute plots. So there'll be 2 public plot cards that are laid out at the start of the game that any player can try to achieve and work towards. And then each player will also have their own individual plot card that they keep hidden and keep to themselves, but that they can also be working towards. Okay, so let's talk about the sequence of play. So once you're set up, this is just an example of a 2-player game here. How do the player turns go? The player turns are broken down into 3 different phases. There's an event phase where events and edicts will be updated. We're going to come back to that and actually talk about that after the other phases. There's the action phase, which is where the main action takes place during a player's turn. And then there's a check phase at the end of their turn where they update and refresh a few different elements and close out their turn. So we'll go into each of these in a little bit more detail. The game continues around and around the table with each player taking turns until a game end condition is met. So there are 2 ways that the game can end, which also determines how victory is determined. One, which is the primary way, is getting a plot victory. So if a player is able to claim 2 or more plots during their turn, they automatically and immediately win the game. Or after the 5th edict event is resolved, the game will go to faction scoring, which basically means kind of time has run out for the Illuminati to expand before these edicts shut down their operations. So the scoring is a little bit different, and we'll explain both of those a little bit later. Okay, let's talk about the action phase of the game and the basic actions that you can take during your turn. So I've just done an enlargement of the Areopagus card so that you can see a little bit more easily what we're referring to here. But during the action phase, there are a few things that you can do. You can take up to 2 main actions, and the main actions are listed here on the Areopagus card, and we'll go through each of those individually. You can take any number of scheme actions, which we'll explain, that basically is ways of playing cards from your hand for their ability. Once per turn, you can claim a plot card. And then once per turn, you can claim a faction card. And then just as a reminder, you can always spend 3 of one type of favor to count as 1 of another kind when you're paying for costs for abilities and actions. Okay, so let's start with the scout action. So the scout action is really what you do in order to expand and explore the map and kind of discover new luminary cards. So how the scout action works is that you pick a card where you have influence. And at the start of the game, this will always be your Areopagus card. It's up next to the map. It has an influence on it. You will then pay a favor matching one of the factions that's on the card that you've selected to do the scouting. In this case, your Areopagus card uses the factions listed on your contact card. You'll start the game with one of each of these resources. You always have resources that you can use to scout. You then pick an adjacent card that's face down. You draw that card into your hand, and then you put any card from your hand back in that card's position face up. That can be the card that you just drew. And that is it for the scout action. Pretty straightforward. The next action is the influence action, which is how you expand and grow your influence across cards that have been scouted on the map. And so the way that you do that, again, you pick a card where you have influence. So at the start of the game, that's just going to be your Areopagus card. You pick a card that's adjacent to put influence on, and you can place 1 to 3 influence on the card depending on how many open locations are available. So on a rank 2 card like this one, there's 2 circular areas where influence can go, and you'll pay the favor cost listed inside that location for each influence disc that you're going to play as part of that action. So in this case, I have 1 crown nobility and 1 profession favor. So if I were to spend those, I can place an influence disc on that location, and that would be my influence action. If I had more favor to spend, still just as 1 action, I could have potentially put down 2 influence discs onto that card. The one exception to this rule is that crowns, this kind of X-shaped symbol, are a little bit different. So there's 1 crown and 1 ace associated with each of the different suits. Once a player has crown or has influence on a crown, no other player can influence onto that card. So in this case, my rival here in red has placed their influence on it. I can't expand off of this card onto the crown because they already have influence placed on there. But the other way around, since this card is not a crown, my rival could potentially influence onto this card and we would both have influence over it. So it is possible to go that way. Okay, the next action moving down is extort, and this is the basic action that you use in order to gain more favor to be able to use to power other actions. And how this works is you pick a card where you have influence, and you're going to gain the favor value of that card. Again, that favor value is listed under the card's name. Essentially, it's the same thing as the cost that you pay in influence to get the card, or to get an influence onto that card, I should say. So if I were to influence off of this card, or excuse me, extort off of this card, I would get 1 nobility and 1 profession favor off of it. Now there's 2 other rules that are important about extorting. One is what's called the whisper rule, and the whisper rule is if you have cards that also have your influence on them that are the same rank, that are adjacent to the main one that you picked to extort from, you also get influence off of those cards. So in this case, these 2 cards are also rank 2. I have influence on them, so I'm also going to generate favor off of those cards. And then the second special rule on extort is conspire. And conspire means if I'm generating favor off of a card and extorting from it that has a rival influence on it, I have to pay that rival 1 of the generated favor for each of their influence that's on that card. So in this case, this card generated an artist and a nobility favor. My rival has 1 influence on that card. I'd have to give them 1 of these 2 of my choice after I generate that favor. So that is the extort action. The next action is organize, and this is a way of being able to move your influence that you've already placed onto other cards, essentially representing, using your contacts that you have influence to help get influence and spread onto other adjacent cards that people may know. And so how this works is you pick a faction of your choice, and then you pay a favor that you have in your pool corresponding to that faction. So in this case, if I picked nobility and paid a nobility favor, I can then take up to 3 moves. And each move means moving one of my influence from a card of that named faction to an adjacent card. It can go to any adjacent card of any faction, but each move has to be from a card of the faction that I paid a favor in. And so, for example, if I wanted to move this influence onto an adjacent card, I've paid my nobility. I can now move that over here. That would be 1 move. I get up to 3 moves, so I could, for instance, move this favor 1 move, 2 moves, all the way up to here. And I can move it off of this card. It would be 1 move to move it to here. That is also purple, so I could hop it again for another move and move it up. And this would be 3 moves total. So that's the organize action. The next action to cover is expel, and expel represents essentially kicking a potential Illuminati member out of our map, out of our network of connections here, and being able to replace it with somebody else, which can be really powerful later in the game for helping to achieve those plot cards or to deny your opponents an ability to get one of their plot cards. So how this works, similar to scouting, you're going to pick a card to be the kind of acting card to perform the expel action. So in this case, say I've picked this card, and let's say I want to expel this adjacent card. The acting card obviously has to have my influence on it. The adjacent card doesn't have to have my influence on it. In this case, it does, but you can't target a card to expel if it has opposing influence on it. So this card here, for instance, I couldn't choose that as a target for my expel action. What I'm then going to do is for each influence that's on the card that I want to expel, I have to pay a favor matching the acting card. So in this case, there's 1 influence on the target card, so I would have to pay 1 either purple or green nobility or profession favor to be able to expel this card. So if I pay that cost, say I pay a green profession favor, that card gets discarded, and then I can replace it with any card from my hand. If that card didn't have any influence on it, the cost is still 1. There's a minimum cost of 1. If you do have influence on it and it can fit on the new card, that influence can be moved over and placed directly on the new card. So this is a way of changing the map around mid-game. The last main action in the game is the oust action, and this is a little bit more of an involved action, but it's the primary way that you will actually compete and kind of butt heads with your rivals to be able to push their influence off of particular cards and create space for you to move your influence onto those cards. So there's a few steps to how this works. First, let's say I want to kick this influence off of this card, my rival's red influence here. So that's the influence that I'm targeting. I have to pick a primary card that's acting to do the oust action. So in this case, I'm going to pick this card that I've used before to be the acting card. And as with other actions, for each influence that I'm targeting, I have to pay a cost to oust. And that's going to be paid in favor matching the card that's performing the action. So I have 1 rival influence that I'm targeting. I would have to pay either a nobility or a profession favor in order to cover the cost of that action. The next step is that both players determine their initial strength in the challenge. And you do that by looking at how many influence you each have on the card where the action is happening or the oust is being targeted, as well as each directly adjacent card to that one. So what that means for my opponent, they have 1, 2, 3 influence that's adjacent to the one that's being targeted, including the one that's being targeted. And then I have 1 card there, 1, 2, 3, 4 other influence. So I have an initial strength of 4, and my rival would have an initial strength of 3. And whoever has the higher value of initial strength has the advantage going into the fight, into the challenge. Whoever has the lower has the disadvantage, and this is relevant in a minute that I will explain. Okay, so the next step is that after we've determined our initial strength, each player simultaneously chooses a card from their hand, plays it down onto the table, and then we both flip them over at the same time. And what we are looking at are the power strength numbers that are on those cards. The values range from 2 at the low end up to 6 at the high end. And we're going to each take that number and add it to our initial strength. So my rival played a 4 plus 3. They have a total of 7. I have 6 plus 4 for a total of 10. So I've won the fight and won the challenge. If the result is a draw or a tie, the defender wins those ties. Nothing further happens bad to the attacker or the acting player other than they lose their favor that they paid to perform the action. I had mentioned earlier the advantage and the disadvantage. So if one player were to play a crown card, they'll see this symbol, kind of the crossed hammers instead of a number. If you have the advantage and you played the crown, regardless of whether you're defending or attacking, if you have the advantage and you play a crown, you'll automatically win, regardless of what number card your opponent plays. Conversely, if you have a disadvantage and you play an ace card that has this little dagger, you'll automatically win, again, regardless of what the actual numbers were initially. Interestingly, too, though, if both an ace and our crown are played with their players having, their respective disadvantage and advantage, they cancel each other out, and the attacker can choose whether to press the attack, in which case you'll draw. Each player will select another card to play, or they can call off the attack. So the last thing that happens after an oust, let's just say in this example, the attacker was successful, so I was successful. First thing, my opponent will remove their influence from the card, the targeted influence, and they gain a favor of any favor of their choice for each of their influence that's kicked off the card. I will then put a bonus action cube on the card where the oust was conducted. And this gives me an extra action outside of the 2 normally allowed main actions that I can use, but I can only use them if I'm targeting that card where I won the oust. And the choices are that I can either get a free action to influence onto that card. So if I had an artist and scholar favor, for example, I could pay that immediately to add one of my own influence to that without it costing an action. I can pay an associated favor to move a card or move an influence onto that card, or I can also do an expel action on that card, assuming that there's no more opposing influence left on that card. And again, once you use that bonus action, the cube comes off the card. Okay, so that covered all of the main actions, and next we're going to talk about the scheme action. So you can scheme any number of times during your turn, and what the scheme is that you're playing cards from your hand, and each player has a hand of 4 cards. You're going to play cards from your hand to the table face up in front of you and start one single sequence of cards. And so when you play a card, that will trigger its ability that's listed on it. So say I played this card out of my hand. This is an ability that says Buff Scout. When scouting this turn, I immediately collect the favor value of the placed card that I scout. So that's pretty cool. And how you can continue your scheme is by playing a card following it that matches at least one faction of the prior card. And so you can take scheme actions in between taking other main actions. You can add on to your scheme as long as you have cards that you can chain together by sharing a faction with the previous card. And so this next card that I played was a bonus scout. And so again, any of these bonus actions are going to be outside of your two normally allowed main actions. This one says perform a scout action on any card, paying no favor. Treat this card as adjacent when influencing on it this turn. So I could now take that action. Maybe I'll remove that card from the top of the board and then put a new card in from my hand. And this card that I scouted is treated as if it's adjacent to my influence, which is cool. And then because I had this prior card in effect on this turn that says when scouting, I collect the favor value of this card. So I immediately collect the favor value of that card, which is also exciting. And then I could continue the scheme. Let's say I played a third card and these chain together because they both share a professions faction. One of the things that you can do, instead of taking a card's special ability once per scheme action, you can instead collect the favor value of that card. So let's just say I collected the favor value off of that card instead of taking this action that was listed here. So I could get 2 artisan influence and another profession influence. That now gives me quite a bit of influence off of this turn. Enough that I could use one of my main actions to put down, say, 2 new influence onto this card, using all that favor that I just gained. So you can see that the scheme actions can be really powerful for chaining together a bunch of different effects in order to take a really big turn. One other note on this is that aces and crowns are a little bit different. Aces can only ever be played at the start of a scheme sequence. So you can't play them midway along. But the upside is that any card can be played following an ace. It's kind of a wild. Similarly, crowns can only be played at the end of a scheme sequence, and they have a strong ability, essentially giving you an extra action for the turn. Similarly, though, they are a wild. They can be played on top of any prior card, but it does end your scheme sequence, and you can't continue it after that. One of the other extra actions, so not a main action, that you can do once per turn, you can claim a plot card if you meet the conditions on the plot card. So this can be one of the public plots, or it can be your personal hidden plot, in which case you have to flip that over and reveal it. So for example, let's say this was a public plot card that was out that says control a lodge of any faction that contains at least 4 cards along the map edge with at least 4 of your influence in total. So in this case, there is a lodge of 4 cards, all that share the nobility faction. That's all along the edge of the board. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 influence total on those cards within that lodge. So I could claim this plot card, and I do that by putting one of my influence discs on that card. And so for the public plots, it's possible for multiple players to have their influence discs on a given plot if they all meet the conditions on that card. There is an important rule here about claiming plot cards, which is that plot cards that use a faction, that call for a lodge or a faction to be used, if you have 2 different plot cards you're going for, they have to be using 2 different lodges. So you could have some cards that are maybe shared or that overlap a little bit, but I couldn't use this same purple nobility lodge to accomplish, say, another plot card that required the use of a lodge. The other issue, or the other restriction, is that you can't have the cards used to meet the conditions on one plot card be completely contained within a set of cards used to meet a different plot card. So you have to have some non-overlap between your plot cards. The last extra action, again, once per turn, you can claim a faction card if you control the largest lodge of that faction. And you have to have at least 3 influence on that card, and the lodge has to be at least 3 cards in size. So in this case, there's again a nobility lodge just of 3 cards here. I have 3 of my influence on it versus my opponent's 2. I control this lodge. If this is the biggest nobility lodge on the board, I control that. And that lets me take the faction card if it's available from whoever owns it, or if it's in the supply at the side of the board. I can take that faction card, I put it face up in front of me, and I can now use this card on my turn. So all of the faction cards provide a passive effect on the bottom that works like other passive abilities. That's always an effect for me. And then there's a once per turn special ability that you can use on the faction card. Faction cards are very strong. They can be combined with your scheme actions to take some really powerful chains of actions during the game. Okay, so that was the action phase. We'll talk through the check phase and how that works. So the check phase has a few different things. You're going to do a plot check to see if anybody has gained or lost control of any plots that they may have previously controlled. You're going to do an event check to see if any new events get activated on your turn, and then you will redraw, and all players will do the redrawing. So starting with the plot check, first, if a player loses control or loses, no longer meets the conditions on a plot card, their influence is immediately removed from that. The plot check is just a good reminder to double check everyone. So if, for instance, on my opponent's turn, they had kicked me off of this out of this lodge that we used as an example earlier and brought some of their own influence in, I no longer control this lodge. So I take my influence disc and I put it next to the card. I don't bring it back to my supply. I put it next to the card to say that I've lost control of this particular plot. And that's important because if on my turn I manage to regain control of this plot, say I kicked my rival off of a couple of cards and got my own influence back on, I could move my influence back onto that plot card without it counting towards that once per turn limit of claiming a plot. So that does mean, for example, on my next turn, if I could reclaim this plot, I could move my card back onto this, and if I was able to meet the conditions on, say, my hidden plot, I could potentially win, on my next turn by getting both of the plot cards at the same time. So that's the plot check. The next is the event check. So if an ace or a crown card was revealed, and just at least one, it doesn't matter if there was more than one, was revealed either by being added onto the map, you played an ace or a crown as part of your scheme, or an ace or crown was played during the oust in resolving the challenge, then the active player gets to draw 2 event cards from the deck. They're going to choose one to play and return the other to the top of the event deck. And so this is the event cards. There's really 2 types of event cards. There is a what's called an edict event, and there's 1 edict associated with each of the different factions. If you pick the edict card out of the 2 that you have to choose from, you immediately put it into play in front of you. And what the edicts do is they kind of shake up favor. They're going to take all of the favor, regardless of where it is on the board, and move it all back to the supply. So it's going to take the favor away from other players, potentially even yourself. And then 6 of those favor are going to get placed on the edict card. And we'll explain what happens with that in a moment. If you pick a special event card, you're going to put that in your hand, and you'll have an opportunity to play that during the event phase of a future turn. So the last step in the game, or in a player's turn, is redrawing. So first, all non-active players redraw from the deck only back to their hand limit of 4. So if you engaged another player in an oust, they get to redraw their cards. And then the active player has to redraw back up to their hand limit. You can take up to 2 cards from the market as long as you're below your hand limit or at the hand limit. The one caveat to that is that if you take 2 cards, one of them has to be the card that's underneath the Chamberlain. And if you take that second card, you also have to pay a favor. It can be any favor of your choice. So let's just say in this example, I only had 1 card left in my hand. I could draw, say, this card out of the court. If I wanted to draw a second card from the court, it has to be this one that's under the Chamberlain. And I'm going to pay a scholar favor for that. So that card goes into my hand. And then I still have 1 more card to draw, so that last card has to be from the deck because I can only take 2 from the court. After that, you're going to slide the Chamberlain down to the next spot and then replenish the court back up to 5 cards. If I hadn't have drawn the card that's under the Chamberlain, what ends up happening is that this card that's under the Chamberlain gets discarded and then the Chamberlain shifts. So that's how cards cycle through the market, by having that Chamberlain kind of ejecting people out of the court if that card isn't taken. Okay, last phase is the event phase. So here's how the event phase works. The first thing that you're going to do is return favor from edicts. So let's say that in a prior turn, I had played this profession edict. There's going to be 6 favor on that card. And at the start of each one of my turns, one of those favor is going to go back into the favor pool. The other one is going to go into my own supply of favor. And the favor that's on this edict card is locked down. And so there may be some favor in the favor pool, but there won't. This favor won't be available for other players to use. One thing that's important to note about that is if a player is ever extorting or generating favor and there's not enough favor in the favor pool, they actually can take that favor from the player of their choice if another player has that kind of favor. So edicts basically create a shortage of a particular type of favor that can force players to kind of squabble and jockey over who has that favor resource to use. Now, the other part of the event phase, is that if you have an active event in front of you, you discard it. At that point, if you have an event card in your hand, or say the first time you get an event card, a standard special event that's in your hand, and you don't have an active event out, you can play that event card. That event ability is going to go off, and it's going to stay in effect for the entire round until it gets around to you. So potentially other players can be taking advantage of that same event card while it's in play. So that is the event phase. Okay, getting close to the end here, looking at the end of the game and victory conditions in a little bit more detail. So I just wanted to walk through some examples of, say, a plot victory. So a couple of plot cards that are out here. This one that the red player has claimed. This plot card is have influence on a card and 3 directly adjacent cards of the same rank. So for example, this player has influence, red has influence on this tier 3, rank 3 card, and that card is adjacent to 3 other cards of the same rank that they also have influence on. So they may have been able to claim that card during their turn. Let's just say, switching over to green, this was a plot card, another public one that said have influence on each card in a lodge of any faction that connects from the top row of the map all the way down to the bottom. So in this case, there's this lodge of purple nobility faction cutting all the way across the board. They have an influence, at least one influence on each one of those cards. So they would have been eligible to claim that plot at a prior turn. And then let's just say their personal hidden plot card was having influence on 2 different crown cards and at least 4 influence in total. So they have 2 crown cards here. They don't necessarily have to be adjacent to each other, but they have 5 influence in total on crowns, so they'd be eligible to claim that plot card. So on the green player's turn, if they got 2 of their influence on 2 different plot cards, they would immediately be able to win the game. So the other kind of scoring can occur, which is called faction scoring, if 5 edict events have been discarded. And so you recall the edict cards, every turn favor will come off of the edict. When all of the favor is removed from an edict card, it gets discarded. Once that's happened 5 times, the game end is also triggered. And how this works is that faction scoring, you're going to look to identify the biggest lodge on the board in each faction, and each player is going to count how many influence they have in that lodge. And you're going to get a point for each one of those influence in the largest lodge of each faction. So we can kind of walk through this quickly, but there's a fairly large lodge of purple cards kind of snaking across the map here. The green player has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 influence in that lodge versus the red player with 6. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So they'd track their points. There's a lodge of blue cards. These 3 blue cards leans heavily in favor of the red player, so 1 versus 5. Now, in order for a lodge to be formed, it has to have at least 3 adjacent cards in that lodge. So green, orange, and yellow don't have 3 adjacent cards, so they are not going to be counted for scoring purposes in this particular game. Excuse me, not yellow, green, orange, and white. The yellow faction does have a lodge because there's 3 cards here. And so the green player has 3, the red player has 3. This one yellow card that's off to the side over here, that's not connected, so that wouldn't count. So tallying everything up, green has 11 versus red's 14 points. So if the game went to faction scoring, the red player would have won. So just a quick summary to wrap up the game. Reminder on the turn, there's the event phase where you're going to update any of your edicts and discard and or play new special events. The action phase where you can take 2 main actions, any number of scheme actions, and then once per turn you can claim a plot, and once per turn you can claim a faction card. The check phase where you're going to just check to make sure that everybody is meeting their plots or not. Check for any new events that might need to be drawn, and then all players will redraw. And then just a few kind of key reminders, things that sometimes get missed or are worth repeating. Again, lodges are 3 or more adjacent cards that share a common faction. Control of a lodge requires having 3 or more influence in that lodge and more than an opponent in order to control it. And then a reminder about the plot overlap restriction. So you can't use the same lodge twice to meet the conditions on 2 different plot cards. And the set of cards used to meet one can't be completely overlapping or contained within the cards used to meet a second plot condition. So with that, wanted to thank you for sitting through this instructional video. Hope you enjoyed learning about the game, and hopefully you have a chance to play it soon. Thank you very much.